Hello, I'm going to talk about a problem I've seen in just about every FPS tutorial I've watched in the past decade, either for Godot or Unity. Once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it, so I apologize for that. If you're a creator of Godot FPS tutorials, please make sure to include this easy fix so your FPS controller doesn't have this problem. That said, let's get into the problem. Most FPS tutorials give you some good basic code for creating an FPS controller. Usually it's some form of left-right mouse movement rotating the player on the y-axis, and then up-down movement pitching the camera up and down, and then WASD moving the player forward, back, and strafing left and right. However, they almost always miss one key thing, and it's actually easy to miss, so it's understandable why this happens. What's missing is that the player is moving at 60 physics ticks per second, but the camera is often updating at a different rate, usually faster than 60 frames per second. Most of the time you don't really notice them not being in sync, but when moving sideways and rotating your view at the same time, often known as circle strafing, you can observe just how badly out of sync it gets. Now, if your game is locked at 60 frames per second, this looks totally fine because the camera movement is in sync with the camera updates. This clip here is the game running at 60 frames per second, the same rate as a physics engine. You can see it looks totally smooth. But look what happens if the game is running at 90 frames per second. Nothing has been changed about the game itself. The game is just running at a higher frames per second than the physics engine. And again, this is not always this noticeable when you're running around, but when circle strafing, it becomes very obvious. So how do we fix this? It's actually very simple. There's even an entire Godot documentation page that details how to fix this. I'll leave the link in the description. First off, let's look at how most FPS tutorials are set up. I've simplified this one down to only exactly what's needed to demonstrate this problem. Lots of FPS tutorials include tons of great features like jumping, crouching, dealing with stairs, and so on, but we're going to keep it as simple as possible here. You can see there are two scenes, one with the level and one with the player controller. In the player controller, there's a basic character body 3D with a script attached, and then a camera controller node 3D with a camera as its child, and then a script attached to the camera controller. If we look at the scripts, you'll see that the player controller is just pulling WASD movement and turning that into movement based on what direction the player is facing. Nothing really more than that. But do notice that all of this is happening in the physics process, which means the camera controller node 3D is moving along with the player at each tick of the physics process. The camera controller script is simply capturing mouse movement and turning that into either player rotation for horizontal mouse movement or the camera pitching up and down for vertical mouse movement. If we run this, you'll see we get a very basic FPS player controller. But this does have the problem of lots of camera jitter, most obvious when circle strafing around things. So how do we fix this? Well, it only actually takes a few simple steps. First, we need to change a couple project settings. Go to Project Settings and make sure you turn on Advanced Settings. Then scroll down to Physics Common. Here, we're going to turn on Physics Interpolation and turn off Physics Jitter Fix. This is extremely important. This physics interpolation setting tells Godot that we're going to want to find out where physics objects should be in between physics ticks. This is key to fixing the jitter problem. Next, in our player controller, we're going to add a marker 3D at the same location as our camera controller. In my case, the camera's at 1.5 units in the y-axis. I'm going to rename this to Camera Controller Anchor. Now, in my camera controller, I'm going to check the top level setting. This is also very important. This makes it so the camera controller node no longer follows its parent. This means it has its own global position that is untethered from the player. Next, I'm going to go into the player controller script and simply add a reference to the new anchor node. Then, in my camera controller script, I'm going to change this line where instead of pivoting the camera controller node up and down, I'm simply going to pivot the anchor up and down. And the last change is to add a line that tells the camera controller to calculate where the anchor should be in between physics ticks, and then move the camera controller to that position. This means that while the player and the anchor are moving in jumps of 60 frames per second, the camera controller itself will move to all those little positions in between those jumps as the game progresses forward to the next physics tick. Here's the difference with interpolation being turned on and turned off, and it's a huge difference and so easy to solve. If you have questions, leave them in the comments. I'll leave a link in the description to this project on GitHub. Thanks for watching.